They dragged me off the plane, Dad, like I was dangerous. Jalen Carter gripped his phone, fingers trembling as he pressed it to his ear. The sounds of the airport terminal faded into a blur of overhead announcements and the rattling of suitcase wheels on cold tile. Everything around him blurred, except the burning shame and the fire of rising anger. 3 rings, then silence, long enough to stretch time thin until a deep, composed voice finally answered. "What happened, Jalen?" "They pulled me off the plane, Dad." Jalen swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice, in front of everyone, like I was nobody. Silence on the other end. But Jalen knew. It wasn't indifference, it was the silence before a storm. "Which airline?" The man's voice dropped, firm as steel. "Regal Air, Flight 3762 to Chicago." Another pause. Longer this time. Jalen could picture the man on the other end, Malcolm Carter, rising slowly from his leather chair on the top floor of Regal Air's corporate headquarters. The airline he had built from the ground up. "Don't go anywhere," Malcolm said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made Jalen feel suddenly lighter. "I'm coming." Jalen closed the phone and sank into the hard chair in the terminal. No one around him knew that what had just happened, the dragging of a 19-year-old black college student from a plane on mere suspicion, was about to shake Regal Air to its core and spark a reckoning the entire airline industry could not ignore. 3 hours earlier, Jalen Carter had arrived at Gate 32B, just like his father had taught him. Punctuality is professionalism. Even as the son of Regal Air's founder, Jalen always wanted to carve his own path. He chose Sterling College, a small liberal arts school in Chicago, over the Ivy League university where 3 generations of Carters had studied. He booked his own flights, used no special privileges. No one at Regal Air knew who he was, and he liked it that way. He carried a small backpack, just his laptop, a copy of Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, 1 change of clothes, headphones, and a few essentials. He was returning to campus early to help with freshman orientation, hoping to support incoming students of color, young people like him who once felt like outsiders in a world that didn't mirror them. Jalen settled into a seat by the window and opened his book, letting the airport noise fade away, until the boarding call cut through. Group 3. Now boarding at Gate 32B. Jalen stood, scanned his boarding pass. The red-haired gate agent glanced at the pass, then up at him, just long enough to send a signal. Too short to accuse of bias, just long enough to make Jalen's guard rise. "Have a good flight, Mr. Carter." He nodded politely, stepped onto the jet bridge, unaware that in minutes, everything would change. On the plane, Jalen found seat 14A by the window. The man in the aisle seat stood to let him pass without a word. Moments later, a silver-haired woman with elegant posture arrived to take the middle seat. She smiled. "Looks like we'll be neighbors for a few hours." Jalen smiled back. "Yes, ma'am." They started chatting. Jalen talked about his school, his major in politics and African American studies. The woman, her name was Eleanor, mentioned her granddaughter had studied the same field. Everything felt normal until Heather, the lead flight attendant, approached. "Excuse me, I need to recheck your boarding pass." Jalen paused, held up his phone, then his ID. Eyes from nearby seats started turning. His heart pounded, but his face stayed calm. Heather stared at the boarding pass, then the ID, then at his face. "What's the purpose of your trip?" The question dropped like a stone in still water. Eleanor interjected. "He's a college student, just told me all about it." But Heather didn't seem to care. She nodded and walked away. A few minutes later, she returned, this time with the captain and another crew member. "Sir, we need you to step off the plane for additional verification." Jalen froze. "I've shown my boarding pass and ID. I cleared security. Why is this happening? Please come with us, or we'll have to call airport security." The cabin fell silent. No one spoke. Eleanor whispered, This isn't right." Jalen looked around. No one met his eyes. Slowly he stood, picked up his backpack with deliberate care. "I'll go, but I want it noted that I'm being removed from this flight without a valid reason." That was the moment the real story began. You can't build an airline on respect, then look away when your own son is treated like a threat aboard your own plane. At the top floor of Regal Air headquarters, Malcolm Carter stood quietly before the glass wall overlooking the airport runway. The same runways where aircraft bearing the golden wing he once sketched by hand now came and went, thousands of times a day. The phone in his hand was still warm from the call. Jalen's words echoed in his mind. They pulled me out like I didn't belong there, Dad. Not a regular customer, not a stranger, his son. But Malcolm didn't explode in anger. He rarely did. Just as he'd faced financial collapses, industry shifts, and personal tragedies, he responded with strategy and the quiet power of restraint. He pressed the intercom. Diane, cancel all my afternoon meetings. I need the Citation X ready in 45 minutes. Destination, Reagan National. His assistant's voice was laced with surprise. Is something urgent, sir? Family. But it's also a matter of survival for the company. When the call ended, Malcolm opened a drawer and pulled out a worn leather notebook. Embossed on the cover were the words, Regal Air, a vision rooted in dignity. He flipped to the first page where 5 founding principles were etched: safety, integrity, respect, excellence, accountability. His hand paused over the final word, accountability. He took a deep breath. This wasn't a simple operational mistake. This was betrayal. The black car glided away from Regal Air's headquarters, taking Malcolm to the private airport. On the way, he called his longtime associate, Jerome Wu, chief legal counsel, the man who once helped him save the company during the pandemic. Jerome, I need you in DC tonight. This isn't an internal matter anymore. This is an attack on Regal's core values. Tell me everything when I arrive. I'll be flying out from New York in 2 hours. Malcolm ended the call. His eyes darkened. The last time he saw Jalen this hurt was the day his mother, co-founder of Regal Air, passed away from cancer. But this time, his son wasn't hurt by fate. He was hurt by a system Malcolm had built, one that should have protected people like Jalen. When Malcolm stepped into the Reagan Airport terminal, his face showed no anger, yet everyone avoided his gaze. He brought no entourage, issued no press releases, just a carry-on suitcase, a vintage watch, and a face cold as steel. He called Jalen. Where are you? Gate C42, Dad. Give me 5 minutes. It only took 3. Malcolm found Jalen sitting quietly in a hidden corner, arms wrapped around his worn copy of Coates. In that moment, he didn't see a 19-year-old. He saw a mirror, himself in 1988, turned away from a hotel entrance because he didn't look like a business guest. He stepped closer. I'm here. Jalen looked up. His eyes still held a trace of tears, but calm had returned. They embraced, no words spoken, but the message was clear. You are not alone. Let's go home, we'll talk later. But don't worry, I'm handling this. On the drive out of the airport, Jalen finally spoke. They didn't even know who I was, Dad. I used my real name. No perks, no priority ticket, and still Malcolm nodded. That's exactly what makes me feel like I failed. Jalen turned to him. You didn't do anything wrong. I created a system. A system that allowed someone like you to be seen as a threat because of how you walk, how you talk, even your name. And if that system hurt you, it's hurting thousands of others every day in ways I haven't seen. As the car pulled through the gates of the historic mansion Malcolm used as his DC residence, he looked at his son. Do you want to be part of this? Not as my son, but as someone the system needs to hear from? Jalen paused. If it means the next flight doesn't turn into hell for someone like me, then yes, I'll stay. Malcolm gently squeezed his son's hand. Then we start tomorrow. 9 a.m. the next morning. The 45th floor conference room of Regal Air's Chicago headquarters was sealed tight, soundproof glass, no press, no cameras. But everyone in the room knew this was the moment Regal Air would face itself. To the left sat Captain Robert Wallace, the one who ordered the removal of passenger 14A, his face tense, trying to remain composed. Beside him sat Heather Grayson, the veteran flight attendant who had raised the initial security concern. Across from them sat Malcolm Carter, founder and CEO of Regal Air. And next to him, Jalen Carter, the 19-year-old college student dragged off the flight, his son. On either side were Evelyn Tran, Chief Legal Officer, and Thomas Quinn, Head of Culture and Human Rights, who had been investigating internal violations for the past 2 years. There were no microphones, but every word spoken would ripple far beyond the room. Captain Wallace, Malcolm began. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of a gavel. Can you explain why you ordered passenger Fort A to be removed from the plane that day? Wallace cleared his throat. Yes, sir. According to Flight Attendant Grayson's report, the passenger displayed suspicious behavior, frequently scanning the cabin, carrying unusually light luggage for a college student returning to school, and booking the ticket last minute. As per policy, those factors may be considered red flags. Malcolm nodded. Miss Grayson, do you have anything to add? Heather adjusted her posture. I wasn't profiling. I followed procedure. I've been trained over 22 years to recognize odd behavior, and something about the passenger made me uneasy. At that moment, Jalen looked up. He wasn't angry, but his gaze quieted the room. I boarded the flight as instructed, scanned my boarding pass, showed my ID, texted a friend. I sat and read a book. That's suspicious? Heather looked away, said nothing. Jalen turned to Captain Wallace. And you didn't ask me anything? Didn't verify anything yourself? You just made a decision in front of a full cabin? Wallace's hands clenched. He spoke quietly. I followed protocol. My responsibility was passenger safety. Malcolm placed his pen down. His voice turned cold. We're not talking about protocol anymore. Because if protocol allows a young black man to be pulled off a plane full of white passengers with zero evidence, then protocol is a shield for bias, and I will not allow it to exist in the company I built. Heather tried to object, but Evelyn raised her hand. Let me remind everyone, in our internal report, there is no evidence of suspicious behavior. No passenger complaints, no ID or student record discrepancies. Everything was valid. So tell me, what exactly was unusual? If not his skin color? Silence. Thomas Quinn opened the folder in front of him. According to our 2023 internal report, 87% of passengers removed from Regal Air flights for suspicious behavior were either Black or Latino. Yet these groups only make up 26% of our total customer base. These numbers aren't about gut feelings. They point to a system. Malcolm looked directly at Wallace and Heather. I'm not here to avenge my son. I'm here to make sure the system I built doesn't become a legal machine to legitimize prejudice. He turned to Jalen. Do you have anything you'd like to say? Jalen nodded and looked straight at the two seated across from him. I just want to know, if I had been wearing a suit, white, carrying a laptop bag, walking onto that plane with the exact same demeanor, would you have pulled me off? Neither Wallace nor Heather answered, and they didn't have to. The silence was the confession. Malcolm stood. Starting today, I am launching Equity in the Air, a comprehensive overhaul of our training protocols, passenger engagement policies, and security assessments. Both of you will be placed on 2 weeks paid leave to undergo intensive training in unconscious bias and systemic discrimination. After that, we will reassess your roles in this company. He paused. This is not a punishment. This is an opportunity. Heather's voice, suddenly small and trembling, broke the stillness. If I was wrong, I want to make it right. Malcolm nodded, no smile. We'll measure that through actions, not words. The meeting ended. The doors opened. But the echoes would stay in the system for years to come. Jalen walked out first beside his father. He said nothing, but for the first time in 2 days, he exhaled. Not because he had won, but because he had been heard. That same afternoon, in a small apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, 71-year-old Eliza Monroe, former school principal, sat in front of her laptop, hands trembling slightly as she clicked send. Subject line, regarding the young passenger removed from flight RA-2187, my testimony. She knew it was too late to undo what had happened yesterday. But Eliza also knew one thing. Her silence could not become complicity. Flight RA-2187 remained vivid in her memory. Seat 14A. The polite young man with a quiet smile, a light backpack, a James Baldwin book in his hands, and then the flight attendant, asking for papers, giving that look. The captain appeared, tension spreading through the cabin like spilled oil. She had spoken up, just once. He was just telling me about his college. But then she too fell silent. Like everyone else, avoiding eyes, disengaging, pretending it wasn't their place. And the boy, tall, slender, gentle, was asked to leave, despite showing his boarding pass, despite sitting quietly, despite doing absolutely nothing wrong. The next morning she received a reply, but it wasn't from customer service. It was from Diane Hale, executive assistant to the CEO of Regal Air. Dear Miss Monroe, Mr. Malcolm Carter, CEO of Regal Air, would be honored to meet you in person to hear the testimony of a fellow passenger on flight RA-21A7. If convenient, we would like to arrange transportation for you to our headquarters at 2 p.m. today. Eliza stared at the screen. She never imagined a simple email from a retired educator would reach the desk of an airline CEO. But deep down, she understood. Maybe that boy from yesterday wasn't just any passenger. Maybe he was someone more important than any of them had realized. At 1:45 p.m., the black car with the Regal Air logo stopped in front of her home. Eliza wore her navy blue coat, neat, just like her classroom days. She carried a notebook and a handwritten letter for the boy named Jalen. When she arrived at headquarters, she wasn't led to a waiting lounge. She was taken straight to the 45th floor, where something was clearly happening. The door opened. Inside stood Malcolm Carter, and beside him, Jalen, the boy who'd been removed from the plane the day before. He wore a white shirt, his expression calm, but his eyes held something far older than his years. The same weight Eliza had seen in so many of her students of color, those she'd spent 40 years protecting in classrooms across Chicago. "Miss Monroe," Malcolm stood to shake her hand. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat. Today, all we ask from you is the truth." Eliza nodded, without hesitation, and she began. Every detail, every glance in that cabin, the stiffness in Heather's posture, the unease in Captain Wallace's eyes, the way the silence spread like guilt. The moment Jalen stepped onto the jetway alone, like a man being sentenced by an invisible court. Jalen sat silently, eyes on the table. But when Eliza said, "I'm sorry, I didn't do more. I always told my students to speak up, but yesterday I didn't live by what I taught." He looked up, met her gaze, and smiled gently. "You did speak up, when no one else did. That means something, ma'am." Then Malcolm made an offer. "I'd like to invite you, Ms. Monroe, to serve as an honorary advisor to our internal review committee for our Equity in the Air initiative. With your background in education and as an honest witness." Eliza was stunned. "I'm just a retired school teacher." "Exactly," Malcolm cut in. "You represent what our industry has lost. Decency without self-interest. You spoke the truth when you had no reason to." Eliza looked at Jalen. He nodded, eyes kind. "If you agree, it would be my honor to work with you." That afternoon, as Eliza Monroe left Regal Air's headquarters, her heart felt just a little lighter. She knew one protest couldn't undo the past, but it could shape the future. That evening, in a penthouse overlooking downtown Chicago, Malcolm Carter stood alone by a wall of glass, gazing at the city lights scattered beneath the sky. A glass of water in hand? As always, no alcohol, no cigarettes, but his eyes were full of weight. The meeting with Eliza Monroe had left Malcolm restless, not just because of her sincerity, but because of the shame that gnawed at him. The shame of a man who once prided himself on building an airline that respected humanity. And yet, his own son, Jalen Carter, had been dragged off a plane bearing his company's logo, like a nameless criminal. He returned to his desk and opened his laptop. A file appeared on the screen. Flight RA-2187, Incident Review. Passenger List. Surveillance footage from the gate, audio logs between flight attendant Heather Davis and Captain Wallace Grant, all compiled, but something was still missing. Direction. A spark. Someone to lead the transformation. 9:03 p.m. He dialed the only person who could help him do it. "Michael. It's Malcolm." On the other end, Michael Ortega, former head of human resources at Regal Air. The man who had resigned 5 years earlier when his proposal for unconscious bias training was rejected by the board. His voice was calm, but knowing. "I'm guessing this isn't a social call." "It's not, and I'm not calling to apologize. I'm calling to ask you to come back." Silence. Then a soft chuckle from Michael. "I'm listening." The next morning, on the 46th floor of Regal Air headquarters, the emergency restructuring team gathered. In the room were Malcolm Carter, CEO, Richard Lynn, Chief Legal Officer, Michael Ortega, flown in overnight from Texas, Jalen Carter, not just the CEO's son today, but the voice of those harmed, and most notably, Eliza Monroe, now appointed as Community Ethics Advisor, a first in Regal Air history. Malcolm entered the room, eyes sweeping across the group. "We're not here to assign blame, we're here to change." He clicked to the first slide. Equity in the Air, an initiative not just for Jalen, but for the thousands like him who will board tomorrow. Michael was the first to speak. He didn't read a report. He told a story. 5 years ago, I proposed that we train our flight staff on unconscious bias, and I was told, we don't have that problem here. He paused, then turned to Jalen. Now we know, we did. and it's been hurting the very people we swore to protect. Next was Eliza. She didn't say much. She opened the same notebook she had brought yesterday. On the first page in black ink, she had written, "You don't measure a company by how it treats the most powerful, but by how it treats those with the least." The room went still. Jalen looked at his father. Malcolm nodded. "That's exactly where we begin." By the end of the meeting, an internal announcement was sent to every Regal Air employee. Effective June 1st, all frontline staff, from flight attendants to security, will participate in mandatory unconscious bias training designed by an independent advisory board led by Michael Ortega. Additionally, Regal Air is establishing a new division, the Office of Equity and Dignity, to be temporarily coordinated by Jalen Carter with direct oversight from the CEO. Beneath it, one line stood bold. "We believe that justice doesn't stop at the courthouse door. It begins at the airplane door." That night, Jalen sat alone in his new office. Nothing yet but a wooden desk, a laptop, and a whiteboard. He uncapped a marker and wrote the first line. The question isn't, why was I pulled off the plane? It's how many others were and had no one to call. He stood still. Knowing what he was building wasn't just for himself, it was for those who had been silently pushed aside. Monday morning. In a small home on the south side of Chicago, Heather Davis sat at her kitchen table. A cup of coffee had gone cold in her hand. Her laptop was open to an email, but her fingers hadn't typed a single word. On the screen, a training invite. Mandatory participation, unconscious bias and incident review. Regal Air Executive Order subject required action for personnel involved in RA-2187 incident. Heather sighed. She had barely slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the face of that young man in seat 14A. His calm, yet wounded eyes. As he was asked to leave the plane, no one objected. No one asked a question, only silence, and the nod from Captain Wallace Grant, now also summoned. She whispered aloud to herself, "I was just following protocol, right?" But it was that very protocol that removed an innocent passenger from his seat, because he had a last-minute ticket, a light backpack, and because he was black. 9 a.m., Regal Air Headquarters, 12th floor conference room. Day 1 of training began with a silent video, footage from the cabin camera on flight RA-2187. No sound, just images. The room was silent as it reached the moment Heather approached Jalen, asking for his boarding pass and ID for the second time. Then, a voice spoke, not from the footage, but from a pre-recorded interview with a former flight attendant. "We were trained to be vigilant, but no one ever taught us to tell the difference between vigilance and bias. One day, I realized my vigilance was always aimed at black passengers, foreign languages, and people who looked different. And I realized I was afraid of my own ignorance." Heather lowered her head. For the first time in over 20 years on the job, she didn't feel shame for making a mistake, but for never daring to face it. Lunch break. Heather stood alone on the balcony, looking down at the street. The breeze was cool, but her chest burned. Footsteps approached behind her. "Miss Davis." Heather turned. It was Michael Ortega, the lead trainer for the session. "I'm not here to judge," he said gently. "I'm here to ask, are you ready to begin again?" Heather looked at him, eyes red. "I made that boy feel like an intruder. I'm not sure I deserve a second chance." Michael nodded. "Deserving doesn't come from never being wrong. It comes from the courage to repair what you once failed to see." That afternoon, as the training ended, each participant was asked to write a personal commitment. Heather sat before the blank sheet for a long time. Then, she wrote, "I used to think my job was about safety. Today, I realize safety is not just checking bags and boarding passes. Safety is when every passenger is treated like a human being, without assumption. I will relearn how to see, and if it must begin with an apology, then I'm sorry, Jalen Carter." She folded the paper and placed it on the table. As she left the room, Heather didn't know whether she'd keep her job. But she knew one thing: she had stepped out of her comfort zone, and for the first time was seeing others not just with her eyes, but with her heart. That same afternoon, on the 18th floor of Regal Air HQ, a new office bore a new sign: Equity and Fairness Innovation Program. Jalen Carter, 20 years old, wearing a simple white shirt and holding a folder, stood at the whiteboard. Next to him were two advisors: Angela Kim, organizational culture expert; Jason Wolf, internal communications director. But in this moment, all eyes were on Jalen. He took a deep breath. I'm not a sociologist. I haven't graduated. I'm not a spokesperson. But I am the person who was pulled from a seat I legally paid for, under the eyes of dozens of people. And if that's what it takes for Regal Air to reflect on itself, then maybe I do need to keep going. Silence filled the room. Angela gently placed a hand on his shoulder. The question isn't whether you're qualified. The question is, do you have the courage to stand on the front lines, where so few ever do? Jalen clenched his fist, then nodded. If we only talk about justice after a video goes viral, it will never be enough. A few weeks later, Regal Air made it official. Jalen Carter was appointed Director of Equity and Inclusive Culture, a brand new position with full independent authority. Social media exploded. A 20-year-old just became the one to change an entire system. Finally, someone at the top is willing to sit down and listen to those at the bottom. Inside Regal's internal forum, over 2,300 employees attended Jalen's first live stream. No slogans, no slides. He just told the truth, no embellishment, no filters. I didn't come here to teach anyone, Jalen said, his voice calm but clear. I came to do what I wish someone had done for me that day. To stand up and say, wait, we can do this differently. 1 month later, Jalen's office had become a transit hub of truth, a place where frontline workers, passengers, and long silent voices came to share their stories. One anonymous flight attendant wrote, I was once told I was too black to work first class. I stayed silent for 4 years. Thank you, Jalen. Now I know I'm not alone. A maintenance worker of Asian descent sent a message. No one ever asked how I felt being called the virus. You're the first to speak up for us. Jalen read every word, took notes, replied to each one, alone but never truly alone. One morning, Jalen met his father, Ethan Carter, the current CEO of Regal Air, in the boardroom. Ethan said, You don't have to carry this burden just because you're the CEO's son. Jalen met his eyes with quiet resolve. I'm not doing this because I'm your son. I'm doing it because I was pulled from my seat like I didn't deserve to fly. And I don't want anyone else to go through that again. That was when Regal Air truly began to change. Training protocols were rewritten, not just by legal teams, but by frontline staff themselves. Passengers who had experienced discrimination were invited to join a policy review council. A scholarship fund was established named Second Flight for young people who had been denied opportunities due to bias. And through it all, Jalen stood at the center, not as a protester, not as a symbol, but as a steady voice of change. No shouting, no confrontation, just the unshakable belief that we can do better. 3 months after the incident, Regal Air hosted its first ever Aviation Culture Innovation Forum. For the first time, passengers, flight attendants, technicians, and even former victims of bias all gathered under one roof. And the event didn't take place in a hotel ballroom. It was held in a renovated old terminal, transformed into a living museum, displaying photographs, testimonies, and documents from those who had once been ignored. Jalen Carter, now 20, stood on stage. No podium, no introduction, just him and the light. That day I was pulled from my seat on Flight 8734. But what I remember most wasn't the hand on my shoulder. It was the eyes around me. The silence, the looking away, the complicity born of fear. I don't share this to assign blame. I share it to remind us we once looked away. But starting today, we can choose to look straight at it. The room fell silent. Then, someone stood. It was Angela, a former flight attendant who had resigned after enduring years of mockery over her husband's skin color. Thank you, Jalen. I didn't speak up that day, but today, I won't stay silent ever again. Another stood. Tomas, a Latino maintenance worker. I used to think my story was too small to matter, but you turned a personal pain into a movement. Now I'll do the same. From that day, the ripple spread beyond Regal Air. Skynova Airlines announced a restructuring of their HR department to better reflect frontline realities. The North American Aviation Association launched a campaign titled We See You, encouraging passengers to share moments of injustice. Multiple airlines brought in anti-discrimination experts to rewrite complaint response policies. And at the heart of it all was a second-year college student. No political ties, no corporate power, just the truth of what had happened to him. In a final interview with the press, Jalen was asked, If you could go back to that moment when you were pulled off the flight, would you do anything differently? He paused for a few seconds, then smiled. I'd still stay silent, like I did. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted to see who would speak for me. And someone did. An elderly woman named Elena, a fellow passenger, sent the very first complaint email to Regal Air. Her testimony helped launch the internal investigation. When Jalen met her again, she said, "Back then I was just a retired woman, trembling as I wrote that email, but today I feel like I'm part of something much bigger." Jalen held her hand. We all are. This story isn't about a boy being dragged off a plane. It's about what happened after. About a CEO, a father who chose action over excuses. About an airline, Regal Air, that dared to turn failure into a foundation for reform. And about a new generation that doesn't just call for change. They walk into boardrooms and rewrite the rules. If you've ever witnessed injustice and didn't know what to do, remember, one voice can begin a movement. Have you ever seen someone treated unfairly on a flight? Were you the one who stayed silent? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you believe that fairness should never be a privilege, it should be a standard. And if anyone's ever told you that you didn't belong in your seat, maybe it's time you redesigned the entire cabin.